Okay, why don't we get started? Yes, hello everyone, and people are still joining, but I'll get started because we've got lots to discuss, and it's just me doing the introductory blurb, which isn't that exciting. So, hello everybody, welcome to the second in our two-part series on regenerative agriculture, in which we'll explore what the implications might be of corporate engagement in this concept. For those of you who weren't able to join us for our first event, you can find a recording on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And we've also written a little summary of what's discussed, which you can also read if you're interested. So I'm Tara Garnett, I'm the director of Table. Table's a collaboration between the universities of Oxford, Wageningen, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, Cornell, the University of Mexico, and the University of the Andes. And we explore issues and debates around the future of food. So for this afternoon's session, I'd like to welcome back our four great panelists. To remind you, if you weren't there at the first event, they're Matt Ryan from Nestle, Melissa Ho from WWF, Sarah Farley from the Rockefeller Foundation, and Jyoti Fernandez from the Land Workers Alliance in the UK, which is affiliated with La Via Campesina. There's a fifth participant, which is my cat, who I've tried to keep out the room, but he keeps hiding behind the sofa, so I can't, so apologies. Anyway, their biogs, not my cats, are posted in the chat. And note that Matt will have to leave about 15 minutes before the scheduled end of the session. So just to remind you before we get going as to why we titled the event as we did, it's because we wanted to ask how systemically challenging regenerative agriculture is or ought to be. That is, how it relates to wider food system goals. So what I mean by this is if a farming system has certain characteristics that could be defined as regenerative, perhaps around soils or biodiversity, but its end products are those that are bad for us, like confectionery, crisps, biscuits, sugary drinks, etc., then what exactly is being regenerated? So we discussed a bit of this at our first event, and at that event, everyone agreed that business as usual isn't working and that we need some big changes for the food system, which of course everyone generally does agree upon. People agreed that as it stands, regenerative agriculture isn't yet clearly defined, can mean different things to different people, and this exposes it to the risk of greenwash. And there was another issue that was agreed on, which was the need for us all to be more farmer-centred. And during our conversation, there was a lot of metaphorical language used. There was the language of journeys, which was very common, with people taking their first steps towards some ultimate desired goal. And there was also the analogy of the swimming pool, which Sarah offered, which has a shallow, a middle, and a deep end. So some people are starting to splash around the shallow end, which is welcome, and this is about agricultural practices, perhaps around soils and carbon. And then as you get a little bit further into the pool, you start to take account of other wider environmental goals. And then once you get to the deep end, you're bringing in things about ideas about social justice. And here, regenerative agriculture ends up somewhat synonymous with agroecology, or maybe you go beyond the pool and that's the ocean. I don't know, but that was the general tenor of the conversation. And by the way, as a quick plug, we have a little visual on our website which tries to explore in a visual way the relationship between regenerative agriculture and concepts such as organics and agroecology, which we'll post in the chat. So that's what we discussed, but there were lots and lots of things that we either didn't discuss or only loosely touched upon, or that we skated around. And that's what I want us to drill into a bit more today. And those questions, those issues are around questions of journeys and endpoints. If we're all on a journey, is the destination actually the same? There are questions around the role and nature of evidence, which could be around bottom up, top down, about the purpose of research. Is it to prove a point? Is it to challenge an assumption? There are questions around finance, about how much is needed for a transition, not just about how much, but from what sources, i.e. which financing mechanisms are legitimate or not. Then there's questions of responsibility. So who's responsible for driving transformation? And as part of that, what is the role of the consumer individual? That question about greenwash and how to address it. And lastly, the question of minimum basic principles with definite timelines and targets. Can we agree on any of that? So I'm going to start with a really big question, but before I do that, I'm just going to say we will have time at the end for audience Q&A. So post your questions in the Q&A, and if you want to chat, post it in the chat. So that's enough of a preamble for me for now, and I'm going to start with the really big question, which is about journeys, endpoints, and visions. And I'm not going to kind of target anyone in particular. It's who wants to pitch in first. So we all agreed. So my question is this: we all agreed that business as usual isn't an option. But I want to know what business unusual looks like. I want to know what your actual vision of a good regenerative food system looks like. And I'm going to ask some kind of really kind of specific, perhaps simplistic questions, but does such a system still include large corporations? Would there be any regenerative foods at all in such a system? What would the role of the state be? How would these, would there be smallholders? Would there be large? What would be the kind of scale of production and distribution and provisioning? Would profits be being made from the food system? So I'm getting into utopia here, but I think regenerative agriculture sometimes is a bit about that. So who wants to start? I've silenced you all.
I'm happy to start and pass it to my surely better equipped colleagues. But I mean, this question of what does a regenerative future look like is one that really gripped us as the Rockefeller Foundation was turning its gaze from a real focus on post-harvest loss, which is where we were about 5 years ago, to a food systems approach. And what we quickly recognized was like, it's not for us to decide what the vision is. That's utterly not the role of philanthropy. I wonder if there's ever been an attempt to aggregate all the visions for what future food systems that are regenerative look like. And so we actually put forward a prize for visions, and specifically is what does a nourishing, equitable, and regenerative future look like for the year 2050? Our timing of this was terrible. We ended up launching it right before COVID, but it elicited a tremendous response. Over 1,300 teams, over 4,000 organizations, 119 countries. I'll pop the link in the chat. But we spent a lot of time, far less time than the visionaries did, making sense of the patterns and the trends. And I can say a few things about them. One, the vision of a regenerative future is totally place-based, and it's completely cultural. So what it means for a small community in the Andes versus a large metropolis, Beijing, it takes such different formats. What people imagine eating, how they imagine growing, how the relationship between urban, rural, peri-urban, how that plays out really took so many different sort of forms. And yet there are a few really powerful trends that came through. One is this notion that through a regenerative system, food is medicine, that food itself nourishes our bodies, and it takes us to a higher state of health. And I think we can agree from the data that that is not achieved through a diet consisting of ultra-processed food predominantly. Food as community was another key theme, that this idea of the practice and the culture and the recognition of food as a celebration of who we are and our connection to the land was, it really sprung up through visions throughout the world. Food as reconciliation was another theme, reconciling the broken relationship for so many cultures in the West with nature, with indigenous peoples, with their own traditions, that food itself, and it's why we actually in this process, through it being a competition, elevated a top 10 at the very end of this. One of them is an indigenous community, the Sichangu in South Dakota. And it's a kind of food sovereignty meets agroecology meets kind of revival of cultural traditions that have been overtaken by colonialism and capitalism. And that the celebration of food actually reconnects a whole people to their identity. So I think, it's easier to draw these rather high meta themes that connect depictions that are quite specific to people. But I'll let everybody listening and the fellow panelists take a look at the beauty and the diversity of the visions that came forward, because it gave us a lot of hope during COVID.
Thanks, Sarah. Would anyone else like to? Melissa.
It's always hard following Sarah, and yet easy because she lays this inspirational tapestry, if you will, on what a vision should look like. And so I love everything that she said. And really, WWF, we associate so much on the outcomes and what that Vision Prize did in talking about the diversity of what food system transformation should look like. So that was, I think, a third point, right? There's not a one size fits all or silver bullet practice that regen ag, everyone across the world needs to have cover crops and then you're regenerative. So I just really want to capture the beauty and inspiration of what she said, but also highlight this not a one size fits all, and that there is inherent diversity. And that is actually the other piece that we see as a critical component to what a vision should look like. It should be different, cultural, place-based. We couldn't agree more. I think the only pieces I will add that there are actual, less inspirational but more accountable, perhaps, frameworks that do exist to start putting definition and tracking. Are we close to achieving that as a local community, as a global community around food systems change? So we know on the planetary health side, we have UNFCCC, the climate framework, that has now put a collective goal for the planet of adhering to a 1.5 degree world. And I don't need to go into all the details of why that's so important and how we got to that goal, but that is one that's established with science, and that we know food systems are a third or more of our emissions. And so a regenerative ag system needs to make sure that those emissions are brought down by more than half in order to get to that 1.5 degree world. That's just basic facts and science. We also now have on the planetary side, last December in Montreal in 2023, actually, gosh, 2022, sorry. It's been a whole year. The Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, also a UN protocol that has established essential nature targets, which includes not only, they're not as clean and easy to repeat as a 1.5 degree, but things like 30 by 30, where in order to achieve nature restoration and conservation, we need to preserve habitat. So this 30 by 30 metric of 30% of the world's earth by 2030, and what does that look like? How do we prioritize, et cetera? Another one is reducing the footprint of our consumption, which includes food. So there are things within the CBD that countries are signing up for, that private sector is aligning behind. There's real targets on financing that we need to unpack. Sarah touched on a lot of where the gaps are last time, and this is highlighted in these kinds of frameworks. And then on the people side, right? So these are just examples of two really important things if we care about climate and nature. And then you could say water, there's a lot of other ways we're measuring over allocation of groundwater and where ag is a role. So in the global as well as local context, we have ways of saying, are we meeting the mark in specific places, let alone racking it up globally? And then on the people side and the nutrition side, I would just say, what are our global metrics on malnourished people? I just had a dinner earlier this week, convened by Rockefeller Foundation and leading experts on a new, short but small important paper from IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, showing that the trends due to climate, conflict, and post-COVID are still showing food security numbers going in the wrong direction. So we still have a growing number of people in the world that are severely hungry or malnourished, and that's a problem. Similarly, as we know, we see rising rates of obesity and people not overnourished, but having what they're eating not only not be medicine, but be the largest source of disease and mortality. And Rockefeller and others have funded, there's considerable amount of research showing that our food systems are not only saving us, but they're killing us. And so these metrics are also things we can look globally, but also locally in a country and subpopulations within. Are we meeting the mark on nutrition outcomes? And then the third one on livelihoods. I think there is a real value on making sure the farm sector is viable. We need rural producers, we need farmers, we need urban producers too, but predominantly right now our food is produced in rural areas. To quick answer to Tara, I think we need large and small. We need a diversity. There's not a one size fits all of actors across any parts of the supply chain, is I think what we would say. But I'd say, is the farm sector healthy? And then what and how are we doing as public and private sector to support the farm sector in staying healthy and viable? Because we need producers to be able to make a living and feed their own families. And then we also need to say, is that public sector support helping us achieve these other goals, right? They need to stay in business, but we also need to be producing food that helps nourish people, that helps nourish the environment. And so is our public sector support doing that? And I think that was a topic of conversation in the last. Sarah also had brought up this need to repurpose subsidies, not to say we're taking it away from the farm sector, but that we need to realign it with what our shared values are and what the food system should achieve. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Melissa. We'll come on to finance in a bit. I'm going to just push Jyoti and Matt a little bit more on the kind of specific question, though. Nobody has yet mentioned the word ultra-processed foods, however we define them. What place do they have in a regenerative future? Who'd like to go first?
You want me to tackle that one?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. No, look, and I think I've been thinking about this since the last session, actually, and particularly in relation to the spectrum that we've been talking about and the swimming pool analogy. And I think, we have, I guess, the discussion around where we're going is sort of going in two different directions. And I think there's two books that I read back to back, which sort of explain the two different camps. And one of them is Regenesis by George Monbiot, which is pushing us towards a hyper-processed future of centralized production of single cellular organisms that are apparently going to nourish us in the future. Which again, it may unlock lots of land for rewilding and for benefits of nature, but potentially worsen our food security challenges. The other book that I read after that was a direct response to Regenesis, which is called Saying No to a Farm-Free Future by Chris Smage, which advocates for a more, I guess, a move to the country, I guess, and more sort of agrarian ruralism, I guess, which again, they're completely at different ends of the spectrum that we're looking at. But I think we do need to try and find a balance in this as well. I grow my own vegetables. I really enjoy the process of growing my food, and I would love the opportunity to be able to have some sort of a local system where I am, but I live in the suburbs. I would love to be able to throw the scraps over the back fence to the pig that lives in the right of way, but that's not going to happen. And I question how scalable that sort of solution might be. And again, you mentioned at the start, Tara, the utopia that I think we all, we need to be directed by that, but I think we also need to recognize where we are at the moment and some of the challenges that we face. One of those challenges is time. Actually, we need to get moving on making these transitions and not get too bound up by definitions in terms of regenerative agriculture, but also time because people are busy. Life is pushing us all in different directions. People don't necessarily have the time to cook from scratch, and I think, figuring out where we are in terms of, having time to nourish ourselves properly, but also, ensuring that families have food that their kids will eat and that it's quick and that they have time to make it is actually quite important as well. we have a skills gap, I guess, as well, in terms of and again, Henry Dimbleby raised this a number of times in his book recently, where we actually, as a society, we don't know how to cook anymore, and so I think that needs to be one of the key enablers to help us get to a situation where we do have consumers that are willing to invest in good quality food. But I think we can't escape the fact that technology is going to push us towards a more and more of these sort of faster fixes. But I think it's how we manage it in that, between now and then, that's the most important thing.
Gotcha.
Can I come in? Yeah. Okay. So I think in counter to that, it's important to realize that there's a huge majority of people in the world that are fed through small-scale localized farming systems. And pre-1950s, the whole world was fed, except for in cases of famine or ecological breakdown, through kind of diverse mixed farms that were connected to the local ecosystem. They might look different wherever they are, of course. It might be a seaside landscape where people are small-scale fishers, or it might be a forest farm, or it might be a small-scale holding, whatever it is. But people were fed like that. And it's actually still the case that the majority of food security comes through these localized agroecological food webs. I mean, the statistics from the ETC group say that 70% of global food security is actually provided using 30% of global food land resources by the agroecological food webs. And conversely, the industrial food chain is producing 30% of global food security using 70% of global food resources. That's land, water, etc., because they're extremely high in the use of raw materials to produce very inefficiently ultra-processed foods and foods that generate quite a lot of food waste. So there's almost 30% of food is actually wasted by these kind of food chains that have industrial food processing as part of it, and that you get quite a lot of factory farming of meat and things, which are also really inefficient use of ways to provide calories for human beings. So this idea that it's just a few people, everybody having to produce and cook their own food, is actually not what we're about. It's actually the fact that there are a lot of people out there doing this kind of farming, and they're effectively blocked by legislation, by trade rules, by different sorts of maldistribution of land resources and agricultural resources from operating as efficiently as they could be operating, yet they're still producing in the face of all these barriers that are being placed by politics that are led by the type of greenwash and the type of, basically stories that are spun by global corporations that they're the ones actually effectively feeding the planet, and they keep the resource flowing that way and keep legislation flowing that way, and they dismantle the kind of protections that actually protect livelihoods for farmers and localized food systems. There's been underinvestment for almost 3 decades now in localized food systems, where there's been a huge amount of investment in setting up global supply chains and global trade agreements to make it more difficult for these agroecological food webs to maintain the efficiency that they need. Yet they can produce at scale. Small-scale farms can actually operate through cooperatives. There can be really efficiency of distribution of the resources. If you look at India, it's the largest dairy producer in the world, where there's 90 million small-scale dairy producers with 2 to 4 cows each, using a default livestock method of production where they don't use loads of soya that comes from the Amazon and high inputs, that drain global resources. And lots of it's within these kind of recycled systems. But because they operate through a cooperative system, where many small-scale producers to contribute to something that is then redistributed, and much of that is processed, and it's through small-scale processing as well, but where it maintains its nutritionally rich value. So the cooperatives will collect this milk, and then they'll make it into paneer and yogurts and all these different sorts of things that can then get redistributed through markets, that maybe the outdoor markets, or people going around with their bicycle distributing, or small-scale distributors taking it places. And it's this like multiplicity of small scale operating at scale through design that makes it possible to do that. But we haven't invested in this design for an awful long time. And there's also a lot of modeling that's been happening. Here in the UK, the Nine Workers Alliance has been modeling whether or not agroecology, even though it's got much lower yields, could actually feed people. Whether with the increased population that we've got now on the planet, which is more than it used to be pre-1950s when agroecology was the dominant form of production. And, we kind of went into all this industrialized agriculture thinking we needed it to feed feed everyone. Well, now we've looked at that, and it is possible even with the lower yields, but it does require dietary change. It does mean that we have to have some control of our land use framework and how we use land to make sure that we're not producing too much of something that uses too much land, and producing things proportionally to be able to guarantee everyone a healthy diet. But it means people will have to eat a bit less meat, a bit less sugar, some of the fatty foods, etc. But all these things are possible. It just means we need to think about what vision we want for our food system, whether we want to reduce corporate control, whether we want to distribute resources more equitably, whether we want to think about processing that actually maintains nutritionally rich foods in their full entirety, or do we move to this more industrial globalized food system that's producing monocultures and nutritionally poor foods?
Thanks, Jyoti. I'm going to cut you off here. I'm also very aware of time, and we've got a zillion questions, not least from me, let alone the audience. But Jyoti, you touched upon the question of finance, and actually Sarah in the last event pointed out the massive finance gap that there is in making, to the barrier to making regenerative agriculture happen. And so my question is, if it's needing an estimated $250 to $450 billion a year to make it happen, bearing in mind, as Sarah pointed out, that the current agricultural system is subsidized to the tune of $650 billion a year. So there is money. The question is, how do we reorientate that? By which mechanisms? And what, if any, are the role of things like carbon and other forms of nature-related markets? And if not those mechanisms, then what? So in other words, how, not just how much money, but by what means?
This is the heart of the issue. Folks probably saw last week the Food Systems Economics Commission, after 4 years of what I think is basically what you were describing, Jyoti, of like, how do you model out what are the assumptions to live within planetary boundaries? What is the production type, and what is the kind of healthfulness that we'll get from future food systems? It's a massive, massive piece of work. I can put the link to it in the chat right here for everyone. But what it found was we will get $5 trillion a year in value if we make this transition toward healthy and regenerative, right? So like, you're asking like what the specific mechanisms are, but like the headline needs to be, it's not just that the money is there. It's not just repurposing subsidies. It's that the wild externalities that we are paying a price tag for, in the United States, the burden of disease, diabetes, cancers, heart disease, etc. These are expensive diseases, and they are supported through our pharmaceutical industry and our extremely expensive healthcare system. We're already starting to build out and have seen from many wonderful partners around the world the economics of what you would call a kind of regenerative, nourishing, healthy diet versus the sort of best in class drugs for, let's just take diabetes. The difference is $40,000 a year, or excuse me, a lifetime for those healthy foods versus more than $200,000 for the drugs. So that's not for the Minister of Agriculture to care about, but that should be for the Minister of Health to care about, or the executive, the prime minister, the president of a country, because it's part of, as my own, work in this space has brought me closer to this deep conviction about regenerative and agroecological approaches. Partly it's to resolve this wild externalities challenge and just the mind-bending irony that we're paying this price tag. So it's just, it's a frustration I'm sharing. It's like, where's the money? You're spending it. You're spending that money. Just don't spend it on diabetes. Spend it on agroecological approaches. So then what does this mean, like very, very practically? I do think it means we need to support farmers on this transition. And one of the things, the Regen 10 network, which spans Indigenous people, farmers, business, science, and funders, is trying to kind of get a handle on is, how can you think about the farmer starting point? So let's imagine 3 tiers. Farmers that are just really not touching regen. They're very much in the shallow end, versus let's take an Indigenous community integrated into a forest ecology, providing food and cultural connection that you would call them perhaps tier 3. So what are the economic, the financial incentives, and the business model, if you will, appropriate to each of those 3 tiers? Well, it varies. I mean, I think it's like every answer to every question on regen is context matters. So with that proviso, one, we need to get direct financing to landscape stakeholders and to farmers for this transition. Jyoti, you spoke about the yields. I mean, I'd love to compare data sets, because we're looking at data sets that show while there is a yield dip during transition, plus or minus 5 years, you come out the other side. And I think also a challenge with like the framing on yield is that frame is dominated by a kind of commodity orientation. So what is the yield on this one thing? What's the yield on maize in this hectare? Whereas if you're polycropping, I was just in the Amazon a week ago with an indigenous community, the Mura Tucumã. They grow 500, they tend to 500 different kinds of plants in what most people wouldn't call a farm, but it's an integrated landscape. And so productivity of any one of those plants might look quite marginal at the level of a hectare. But if you measure productivity at the level of a system, and then I think one of your prompts specifically, Tara, was like, then what of these ecosystem service payment models? Is that what really kind of fills the wedge between what they need and how they get a premium? I think it holds potential, but there's a lot of failures. And especially with indigenous communities, I have yet to get a single story where these carbon markets are actually bringing the value for what they're doing. So I think with all those red lights, it makes looking at biodiversity credits and other ecosystem credits feel like that is an innovation that's needed. But we have to sort out the carbon markets first, because they're showing themselves to not allow for the transparency. There's really interesting efforts trying to overcome this. Regen.network is one where it's the kind of open, forgive me, I'm losing the word, but the kind of open ledger approach to seeing all of the financial transactions from source to destination, and doing that in a way where people are building their own markets around biodiversity. I think innovations like that are really worth watching. But in the meantime, a pathway I don't think we should be pursuing is the sort of premium model, because that will ultimately drive this regenerative agroecology movement, which is growing because of the head start of the agroecology movement, I will say. It will drive it toward the destination of organics, which if you take a country like where I live in the United States, this is viewed as a premium luxury product in many ways. And it's not tenable for folks on fixed incomes to reach for the organic berries in the supermarket. So the subsidies need to come at the level of the farmer. They need to come at the level of the supermarket itself, or the main retail establishment, so that we're actually offsetting the prices of some of these more expensive goods. And in that, my last remark is this Food Systems Economics Commission. One of its big takeaways is there's 5 trillion in the system. Let's reap those rewards, and food likely to do everything we want. The nutrition and the regenerative and the equity is likely to cost more. And I think that's something we really do need to wrestle with. So hopefully my colleagues here can give a go at how we're going to sort that out.
Tara, can I come in on that, please? Yeah, and I think the last thing farmers need at the moment is more debt as well. So I think green finance, has great promise, but I worry that it's going to mean farmers being put under more risk to deliver the specific outcomes that they're looking for. So I think the approach that I'm quite interested in is a green commerce approach, where you treat farmers as business partners, rather than loading them up with the need to deliver on a promise of ecosystem service benefits. So I think that's one way to look at it, where we're investing and supporting farmers to implement new practices, rather than having them on the hook for delivering specific outcomes. I totally agree with Sarah on the risk that premium prices and premium models have in this transition. The last thing we need is a new subset of food. I think if we want to move everyone along, it's going to be incremental. There will be people that move a lot faster, but we need to yeah, if we're serious about making this a transition for the whole food system, then yeah, we need to make it less about compliance and more about continuous improvement.
So where does the support for the farmers come from? From whom? I mean, Jyoti or Melissa, do you want to come in here? You're on mute, Jyoti.
Yeah, it's flipping back and forth. Yeah, I mean, I think from our point of view, when we look at right to food policies, we want to take a bigger picture step back at what happens economically to support farmers' livelihoods globally. I think part of it would be just through pricing, through trade mechanisms, protectionist policies, price mechanisms, things like regulation of supermarket contracts, etc. So some of that's actually the wider economic framework that farming operates in. It's about fairness in the supply chain, using tariffs to stop things undercutting farmers doing the right thing, using trade standards, things like milk marketing boards or whatever it is to try and guarantee fair prices. And that's fallen really out of fashion with the liberalization of things in the face of the WTO and dismantling of all these kind of protections of farmers. But it's a good place to start. That means it isn't all about subsidy. It's also about rules that do things. And then there's a lot of finance that's out there for climate adaptation, and mitigation. And that kind of finance can just go directly to supporting the sorts of farming systems that we want to see. It doesn't need to be through carbon market mechanisms. To me, that is a way of actually supporting more of the control that corporations have over our food system in many ways, because it means that much of that subsidy is going to go to larger farm units. It means that many corporations will be able to greenwash or offset their lack of compliance with reducing the use of fossil fuels or other pollutants, and that kind of thing. And it actually just feeds that whole beast that is actually causing so much of the problem in the first place. So let's just think back to what right to food policies look like, what proper regulation looks like, what proper land use frameworks and frameworks for what we really want to see out of our food system in a proactive manner will look like.
I'll jump in and just add, I think others have covered the complexity and the pros and cons, right, of incentive programs for the environmental benefits and outcomes pieces versus helping to build and provide incentives on the front end for capacity and adopting practices where it's hard to do new things and people need some support on the front end. So I think that is all, these are complicated and we need them both, etc. But I'd say let's look at even something more basic than the complications of environmental services. I mean, why don't you just look at which crops get payments, period, at least in the US, but this is true around the world. So even preferentially treating commodity crops is making a judgment and a value there. And so in the Farm Bill in the US, we have Title I programs that lay out in legislation only a handful of commodities, which I put in the chat, but I just really wanted to answer your question, Tara. I know we're talking about finance, but ultra processed foods, have really been driving shifts in demand for these commodities, and it's a circular kind of thing, because they are highly profitable to make the commodities, but then they're also addictive in terms of what they're doing to people's diets and consumption. And then the public sector is funding this. And so why are we not, and certain crops are outlawed from being funded in these kinds of programs, like fruits and veg, which are very expensive to produce and ship and transport. And we need innovations and research and development on technologies to ship and find ways of keeping the nutritive value of these things. And so why are we not investing in pulses and grains, in beans? Beans is how, right? Like we get nutrition at a low cost, low footprint, and in a very healthy, socially acceptable way. So I just feel like, why are we not using our public dollars on research, on farm support, on market development, on all of these things? Even just look at what crops you choose, let alone which farmers then get payments for services or not. So this comes back again to what is regenerative, and this idea that if a regenerative potato farmer it then sells their potato and it makes a potato chip, is that regenerative? And we need to fundamentally say, why are we subsidizing, these crops in the first place? Why are we not thinking about the regenerative system that is nourishing and restorative to people, planet, and the farm community in general? And that's where, so I put a little bit more challenges I see with, and I really want to support what Jyoti said, that processing in and of itself is an age-old sets of technologies and things that are so incredibly important for household food security and preservation, but for global scale and food security, we need the technologies in our toolbox. But when we get to the category of ultra processing, we are talking of a totally different beast. These are chemical ingredients and processes that are beyond almost recognizing it as food anymore. And then the four things, I know, Tara, you probably want to move on, but that I noted that has really changed the game globally. You can see the trends. There's a body of literature in nutrition, in environment, and in food systems, period, showing that the advent of these technologies and the rollout, the standard American diet is the source and rolled out now around the world. One, right, there's been little nutritive value that's been documented in many, not all, but many ultra processed foods. Two, and the calories are not the same as nutrition in the same ingredient. Two is it has been shown in many instances that they can be addictive. There's salt, sugar, and other additives, and that the way they are metabolized makes you want to eat more. And so the overconsumption, there are many studies now showing that that is not just oh my gosh, I want 5 more of those snack packs. It is an actual physiological thing happening in your body because of how and what they're processed with and how. And then the third and fourth is that they displace local diets and they have subsumed calories. And look in our own country, but look around the world, the trends of the makeup of what people eat. And four, they reduce global consumption to just a few of these commodities where we have 20, 30, 40,000 different species we could eat in the world. And we are now really dependent on just a handful, less than 2 dozen, more like 15, 20. And that is a problem. And that's what's driving intensified production over synthetic use of fertilizers, growing things that should not be grown in those places to scales and intensification that are causing a lot of damage all over the place. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm aware that we are running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to be really succinct on an enormous question, which is on the question of responsibility. So I'm just thinking and wondering, we're all citizens, we're all consumers. One of the people on the panel is a corporation, one is a philanthropist, another's an NGO. I represent the academic sector. There may be policymakers watching. Who's responsible for making any of this happen? I can see, if I were the head of Nestle right now thinking, okay, I'm going to completely rethink my business model starting from tomorrow, it's like, everyone would go to Unilever or Danone instead. So how does this happen? Who's responsible for every single aspect of this? I genuinely don't have the answer, and I hope you do.
I mean, I think by admitting we're in a food system, we recognize that there are so many stakeholders that have influence. So, if this were, we're done with the linear thinking, it's value chain, there's a word on high and everything. It just doesn't work that way. This is a non-linear system. There's emergent phenomenon. One policymaker does X, it doesn't necessarily lead to Y. And it's why it'll take many thousands of us, millions of us in our whole careers, and we still won't get it perfectly right. And we'll only get it better if we work together. That said, I look at the money. So if the cost of this transition is likely at least 430 billion a year for 10 years, and 650 billion is going to subsidies, which is far more than private sector and incredibly, overshadowing the philanthropic sector. Government, if there's one actor that I could be like, wave the wand, change the rules, it's going to be government. And frankly, it's going to start with the US and EU, both on trade and on subsidies. And Melissa just gave the point that there's nothing going into fruits and vegetables. You can lose your water rights in the United States if you conserve water. You can lose your crop insurance if you do polycropping and you don't just do one thing. Like, these rules and the money that supports the farming business as usual is designed to work against regenerative because it is designed for a different era. So it starts with policymakers, I would say.
Thank you. Anyone else have a part?
In your opening, Tara, you especially noted the role of consumers. And so I agree with Sarah, but I also feel that there's a signal that has to come from consumers, not like only consumer choice in the marketplace, but consumers wanting voters, really elected officials that understand these connections and make these issues a priority. And it's complicated and hard, right? So I think we want significant food system changes, and we have some amazing elected leaders in the U.S. working on these things and doing connecting the dots. So, you know, I call out Cory Booker as one of them, right? And urban and rural connects and trying to be more holistic and broad in the vision of what regenerative food systems should look like, not only giving incentives for practice adoption, which that is needed, and we definitely need to think about that, but thinking of more systemic change as well. And so I think voters need to get informed, and then voters need to vote their principles to get this kind of really hard change. Thanks.
Through governments, voters.
Yeah, I think the really boring and uninteresting answer is that it's a shared responsibility, isn't it? I think, obviously businesses like ours have a big role to play, but as you've very aptly pointed out, Tara, it's quite a difficult proposition for, particularly with our portfolio, obviously. But again, we're not stipulating that our portfolio equates to the regular diet eaten by a regular consumer on a daily basis. So I think our role is obviously to advocate for more balanced diets, to be as transparent as we possibly can in terms of the ingredients, reducing fat, salt, sugar content, but then also making real efforts to try and reduce the complexity of the ingredients that are going into our products as well. That's quite important. But again, as the other speakers have pointed out, government, regulatory frameworks, marketing, advertising, all of this, I don't think we're ever going to have a perfect, clear answer for this. Unfortunately, it's a very complex situation.
I mean, to be clear, Matt, I wasn't necessarily feeling sympathetic. I was just trying to make the point that it is difficult, but I do want to probe you on one more thing. In a world maybe that was more, what do you think corporations could be doing that they're not doing right now, and that they would do if they had perhaps more of a, let's say, a more favourable policy environment? So given the existing policy environment and in a more favourable one, two slightly separate questions. Yeah,
I mean, finding or optimizing the health benefits of our products while, ensuring that they remain acceptable and affordable to consumers is really, really difficult. But I think we need to realize that people are unlikely to buy products that they don't enjoy and that aren't within their budget. So I think that, business would, I think this is quite a difficult area for a business like us, because I think, as the others have pointed out, the deep end really is, going towards hyper-local production, which, again, is a challenge for us. Let's be honest about that. We are a business that is dependent on the market as it is at the moment. But again, I think we do need to find a point on that spectrum where we are all making a positive difference and going in the right direction. There's no simple solutions, but I think we need to try and get as many people on board as we possibly can.
Joe, did you have one more brief comment to make about responsibility?
Well, I mean, I do ultimately think people need to, work on a community level and work together. And that might be to just create whatever solutions they can from the ground up. But also, it's really important that systemic change happens, and that will only happen with, what Melissa said, more people getting educated about what's happening and organizing to hold government to account to create that systemic change, make the possibility for individual choices to be something that's realistic for everyone, by making it easier to overhaul the system. So yeah, it all feeds into one part of it all, but really it's about learning as much as you can, getting organized, and demanding some accountability for government for a food system that's truly democratic.
Thank you. So now I just want to kind of shift gears and move to a question of evidence, because that was something that was highlighted at the end of the last event, that we need more evidence. And I wasn't quite clear from listening to people. There was a certain ambivalence or unclarity about the role of what evidence is. Is evidence there to investigate a question? Is the role of research to go out there, investigate a question, and find an answer if it's possible, and communicate it, whether it's the answer you want or not? Or is the role of evidence to support a particular hypothesis about the way the world should be? And I feel that is a kind of tension that is going on in regenerative agriculture. It's such a new concept that it's very, very difficult to distinguish between finding out the question, questioning whether the question is the right question, and all that side of things. I think there's also the real issue of bottom up and top down knowledge, with each side, as it were, feeling that they have a sort of monopoly on the truth. And I'm being simplistic here, but when you have a system that is so complex, and where you can't second and third guess what people overseas or in other places are trying to do, and where there are implications for yields and consumption patterns and knock-on effects and whatever, how do you navigate all that? And what is the role of research?
Just maybe a comment just on the evidence aspect. Yeah, I think the environmental benefits of a lower impact agricultural system are pretty obvious. I think if we're using less inputs, we're disturbing the soil less, we're using photosynthesis rather than chemicals. These are fundamentally good things. And I guess there is a huge amount of research underway at the moment to explore links between regenerative production and nutrient density. I think this is all really important work that, to be honest with you, started decades and decades ago, and never really saw the light of day for quite a long time. So I think the fact that work is ongoing is really fantastic. I think the thing that, in terms of evidence, the thing that's really going to get it moving is ensuring that there is a really concrete business case for farmers to engage as well. So in addition to the environmental impacts, which again, I think we, as I said before, fundamentally, I think everyone knows that less inputs and less disturbance is a good thing, and it's getting us, into the shallow end of the pool, I guess. But to really get things moving, I think this is where the economics, and again, noting the comments earlier that, farming needs to be an attractive income and an attractive career for people to make it a long-term proposition. So I think looking at the economic benefits is going to be really essential. And I was just at an event yesterday, which was looking at some 5 years worth of research that has been done on some of the entry-level regen practices. So focusing on reducing cultivations, which is showing a 10 to 15% net margin difference. And this is in a UK context across 2 different farms. And that's less inputs and less disturbance of the soil. The yield impact was obviously evaluated, but fundamentally what farmers want to see is the margin. What is the difference between what they're spending and what they're getting for their crop? And I think that body of evidence is growing quite significantly. And I think, in addition to the carbon and the biodiversity and the water-related outcomes, fundamentally the livelihoods of farmers is really going to be the thing that moves this along.
Briefly, somebody else. You don't all have to answer.
On this one, I want to actually start with a quote. I threw this report in the chat, but this was a really influential read for me on this question when this report came out, of like, how do we think about the evidence for regenerative transition? So the quote is this: all too often claims about evidence, this is specifically about evidence for regenerative agroecology, that it is clear or lacking, that the data is statistically valid or not, are used to undermine transformative action and create the mirage that solutions lie just ahead of us if we remain on our current path. This is because beyond the surface of the commonly agreed refrain that food systems are not fit for purpose and that humanity cannot continue on its destructive path, there are powerful interests that continue to move the signposts that orient us toward the radical paradigm shift we currently need, and instead keep us locked in the status quo. So it's just to say, even the question, which is, I work for a science-based philanthropy. So we love science, we love data. And there's also politics to the question, because it does suggest the thousands of years of evidence of understanding the relationship between the biodiversity and water and seeds and that all of that knowledge passed on that has withstood the test of time is somehow not adequate because it hasn't been placed in peer-reviewed journals, and therefore it doesn't fit into the kind of Western paradigm, means we don't have enough evidence. So that this politics of knowledge creates a perception that there's just not much there because of the sources, both the human sources and literally the written codified sources that we look at. So that is my headline. And underneath that, there are really important questions that through the prism of what has been codified have not yet been, I think, to a kind of hard-nosed scientist definitively put forward. One of them is, where's the nitrogen going to come from? If what we're talking about with regenerative and agroecology is, if not the elimination, the vast reduction in synthetic inputs, which has a ton of benefits, as we're seeing from a lot of literature, it does beg the question, where do you get the nitrogen? The nitrogen at the level of intensification that's probably going to be required in many parts of the world. We don't yet have a great answer to that question. The business model, I think, is another really, really critical question. But the more numerous questions actually just get super place-based. In this place right here, well, I'm floating in Manhattan, so maybe not exactly here. Out there, like five miles up the Hudson, what is the exact best mix of agroecological practices unique to that soil, that rainfall, what I am trying to grow, the cultural traditions I'm trying to imbue that map to the rainbow of outcomes on the deep regenerative agroecological spectrum. And then multiply that by the billions of intersections of latitude and lines of longitude globally. No, we don't know all of that. And frankly, because of the removal of indigenous people from so many of their lands, we don't even have enough indigenous people that have all those traditions alive and custodians of that knowledge today, which is an atrocity. So there are real questions that need to be answered. And I think the other thing to put in the picture, and then I'll stop, is we also have, I would suggest, enough data to know the way we're producing food through the conventional food system that is requiring 15% of fossil fuel use today for synthetic inputs. Given the reduction in nutrient density of foods, the apple grown 50 years ago versus today, different apple from a kind of biomolecular signature perspective, it's not going to work. So I think we've got that story sorted. But now the question is, what's the alternative, and do we know enough?
Great. Thank you. Look, I'm not going to, I'm going to just put a halt on those questions. I'm going to move to the audience questions. I just want to flag up that I'll be finishing with Matt, you're leaving 15 minutes early. So I'm going to ask that question now because I think it's really important, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. I'd like you briefly to say what do you feel the minimum basic principles of regenerative agriculture are upon which everyone can agree, but more specifically, put some dates and some milestones to action. So where do we need to be in the next, let's say, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and what do we need to leave behind? So what can we agree on, but specifically, what do we need to be doing? And, within those timeframes, try and be brief.
Yeah, I think in terms of minimum basic principles, I mean, there are the 5 sort of very well-known practices that sort of underpin the regenerative agriculture, handbook, I guess, that most businesses will be floating around. So protecting soil surface, maintain living roots in the ground, crop rotation, livestock, and I'm going to forget the last one now. Minimizing soil disturbance. So exactly,
no-till, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, I think, and Sarah touched on it just then. The really challenging piece here is context, and I'm thinking about this from the context of I'm from Australia, which is vast landscapes similar to the US. When I moved to the UK, I was absolutely blown away by just how complex the landscape is. I studied geology at university, and as a result of the incredibly complex geology on this tiny little island, the soil types can vary from field to field. So, one farmer on one side of the hedge might try to do something in very similar circumstances to the farmer on the other side of the hedge and have completely different results. And so I think we need to be mindful of the fact that context is probably the most important element that we need to be thinking about here as well. The outcomes, and again, we've touched on carbon, and I don't want to talk too much about that, but I think, resilience of income and livelihoods is really important here. Without there being a compelling case for the farm businesses to engage in this, it doesn't happen. It's a non-starter. So in addition to those five.
So
Sorry.
in 5 years' time, how does that relate to what you want to see in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we've got farmers in our supply chain who I speak with regularly who are absolutely, swimming down the pool at pace, really quickly. We've also got farmers that are standing at the back of the room with their arms shrugged and shoulders shrugged, not necessarily wanting to engage on this. One of the big challenges that we have, and I think it's certainly a big challenge across the West, is succession, and the fact that farming is a hugely conservative sector in most cases. And there are obviously exceptions to that, but I think the UK, 59 is the average age of a farmer. So not necessarily, and again, I'm speaking generally, but there's not a great deal of not a groundswell of farmers that are really keen to change what they do wholesale at the age of 59 or 60. So I think we need to take incremental steps, and I know that's not a very ambitious way of looking at this, but we've set our own targets around sourcing from regenerative agricultural farms. We're looking for 50% of our raw materials to be coming from those types of production systems by 2030, and I think we do need to be setting key targets, but we can't let those targets dilute the potential impact of what we're trying to achieve as well. So targets are important, but let's not lose sight of what it is that we're actually trying to do as well.
Okay, if you can keep it to about 30 seconds each. Dorothy?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative, which I heard a lot about at COP28, and it completely missed the social economic values that I'd like to see included in a definition of regen agriculture. So that would include equity, about fair pricing, fair workers' conditions, but also looking at a framework for land use, making sure there's fairness in how much land is being used to produce what crops, so that we can actually feed everybody on the planet sustainably. And also thinking about how diversity is included in that, whether that's diversity of people or diversity of crops. Contrary to what Matt was saying, the majority of farmers in the world are women of color. And there's a lot of young people waiting to get into farming as well. And, not thinking about it just as older white male farmers being the only ones that feed people on this planet, but also thinking about equity there and the fact that there's, more opportunity now than ever to get a new form of food system by bringing in diversity in all its forms.
Thanks. Melissa or Sarah, with some targets.
Sorry, couldn't get my button. I think our top line in terms of how WWF is thinking and defining regen ag for ourselves and our partners is this three-legged stool idea. So planetary health, which includes climate and nature. So again, in the US anyway, regen ag is so reduced to carbon sequestration and benefits, which is part of the planetary benefits story, and soil health is by, of course, a huge aspect of what regenerative ag delivers, but it's also about water holding capacity. It's about land use change and decisions on that, and nature and biodiversity. Is part of the planetary health part for us. And then it's about the second leg of the stool is human health, and even understanding, the appropriateness of what is being grown and how it's being grown in that place. And then the third is the social economic health of the sector and the people in it. So I just think we need to incorporate those things. And the only last thing I'll put a plug in, I know we've been sharing a lot of resources. It's hard to pay attention to the dialogue and also try to answer all the really amazing questions in the chat. But I really want to put a plug, not for work that we've done, but watching partners that we really respect and admire. And Tara, I don't know if you were actually one of those partners. The Food Systems Countdown Initiative is a metrics framework that really looks at multidimensionals. It's 5 dimensions, but it includes these 3 dimensions plus resilience and other things. So the planetary piece, the livelihoods piece, as well as the nutrition and human health pieces, as well as resilience and other stuff. So there's a framework of metrics where a series of experts have come together, and it was coming off of the Food Systems Summit a few years ago, and then really thinking that we need a common set of definitions and ways to look at progress over time on how our food systems are doing. So that report just came out in December. It's a great resource, and we are talking about it, and we'll be looking at using it. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Sarah, just like nothing? No.
Well, just to say, I think that HLPE principles are such an important place to start because they went through this tedious process to get buy-in from almost 200 countries. I also threw in the chat the Global Alliance for the Future of Food principles, some of which overlap with HLPE, but a couple of which are distinct. And I think interconnectedness, diversity, inclusion, renewability, reciprocity, these are powerful principles that I think the state that we're pursuing, the state of regenerative food systems, not just production systems, really requires. And I think just a footnote there have been some comments in the chat about the role of farmers, the responsibility, the liability, the valorization. And I think for all of us, not just farmers, part of manifesting these principles is inner transformation inside each of us. It's not just out there, we're changing a system. Reciprocity, interconnectedness starts with how we engage with each other in these debates, our colleagues, our broader networks, our global family. So starts here.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the questions, and what we can do is also post the questions, if the ones we don't get around to answering them, just in the notes after our event, so people can maybe think about them in their own time. But the first question I can see here says, I completely understand, from an anonymous person, I completely understand the calls for place-based solutions as they can meet cultural, social, ecological needs of the communities. But what about large cities like Shanghai, a city with over 25 million people? Certainly you need some of the efficiencies that are enabled by corporations. This question is for those skeptical of corporations. Can you square these two? Sorry, it's just disappeared in my chat now. How come it's...
Yeah,
I think
Melissa was answering, or someone was answering it.
It's been deleted, I think, but I think you get the...
Tara, you can go to the other tab, go to answered, and you'll find it there.
Yeah. Okay, it's been answered. Okay, then you're going to have to teach me about technology. What questions haven't been answered then? Maybe they've all been answered.
It doesn't mean they've been answered well.
Okay, let's go with that. Let's go with the Shanghai question, because I think if anyone's really answered that, I'm impressed. I mean,
I think it's about just creating efficient distribution networks, because you can have the sort of peri-urban areas, or wider than that on a domestic scale, producing at scale through small scale units. If you collect that produce and then you redistribute it, and you have really efficient means of getting it into the city, that's probably the most efficient way, rather than all of it being grown in a city. You can get the vegetables and things there, but most of it should be on the outskirts. But efficient trains coming in, people processing it on the outskirts inputs and then bringing in, and can be redistributed through small scale vendors as well. And you see that very effectively happening in India, like I gave the example of the dairy sector there. That's all very much small scale producers, but it feeds the mega cities of India, which are highly populated.
Anyone else have a comment on that? I'll move.
There's a quote that it's easier to imagine the end of climate change or the resolution of climate change than the end of capitalism. And so listening to your explanation, Jyoti, I think that is totally plausible. And yet my mind goes to who's running the railways, how big is that logistics operation that probably still, even if the suppliers or smallholder farmers, there's a place for the efficiency on the logistics side from entities that really specialize in that. And maybe that's my own mental model of like, there's probably going to need to be some mix still of big and small. But
well, there's models coming out within the just transition networks, of transport workers around the world. I've been to some amazing meetings by unions, including people creating publicly, ideas for publicly owned train systems, publicly owned energy systems, things that can operate at scale. But instead of corporations at the top taking on profit, that money goes back and reinvests in local communities.
Yeah,
or national.
brilliant. Yeah, so that's brilliant. The ownership model is different, but the size and the ability to have the efficiency is about scale. Yeah, got it.
Thank you. So then we've got a question about, again from Anonymous, what will Western diets need to look like to stay within planetary boundaries while using more regenerative practices? Do we need to eat less meat? And if so, who is responsible to drive this transition of diets that in the UK at least is a bit of a toxic discussion, and not just in the UK?
I mean, I think it's a given that people would need to eat less meat, definitely. Pretty much every study comes up with that, but that doesn't mean no meat. It can or cannot, but it's about the scale that things operate at, and trying to use meat, less of it, but in a more efficient way in a diet where it's a highlight every once in a while, and it's and good grains, good unprocessed grains and vegetables form the basis of a healthy diet, and the rest is a little bit of an add-on that's extra. And really, if governments can put the right incentives in place towards land use frameworks, education in schools, being able to help incentivize more education about cooking and different ways of eating, good school meals programs, it's something that consumers can take on board and do more with.
Yeah, this is what the Food Systems Economics Commission was partly designed to address as well. So it did these deep dive 4-year modeling exercises around Brazil, India, China, and a couple other locales to sort of figure out if we are operating within planetary boundaries, if farmers have well-being, if everything is ecologically balanced in terms of how we're growing it, if we eliminate malnutrition. These were one of the design criteria for one of the scenarios. What do we eat? What does it look like? So take a look at the Food Systems Economics Commission, and then Eat Lancet that put forward that question a few years ago. What is the kind of caloric budget? What is the reference diet? Technically a reference diet, not a recommended diet as such, customized to country. That is going into kind of a 2.0, which begins with the question of, in this place, what is the culturally appropriate array of foods? And then through the prism of nutrient density, nutrient adequacy, macronutrient balance, all of those dimensions of healthfulness, and from the dimensions of sustainability, what would the plate look like? So that work will start coming out in the tail end of 2025 into 2026. And I think it'll be an important piece of work to keep an eye out for.
Thanks, Sarah. We've lost Matt because he has to go. But this is a question from Bridget Avison, who asks, are there any examples of governments with policies and legislative action to shift to fair, healthy and environmentally responsible food production and consumption? So examples of good actions, perhaps local government, if not central government. Blank.
There's all kinds. Like Denmark is such a world example on what did it look like to get whole grains in the diet? really cool story from Denmark. I was saying I was just in Brazil. There's a federation of cities, an alliance called Lupa. And at the municipality level, they're linking smallholder farmers, family farmers, and agroecological production into school meals. Jyoti, you're talking about that. It's such a critical social safety net. So the cities kind of linking regen and public procurement in Brazil are really a nice example. In India right now, you get to take your subsidy from the government that would have subsidized your synthetic fertilizer. If you don't use it, you can take 50% of that money to support your production in community managed natural farming. So it's literally, that is an example of a redirected policy from conventional agriculture to what we're talking about here that is live and happening for farmers. And that 50% reduction in costs for inputs is why you're seeing a 2x net income increase for the farmers in Andhra Pradesh that are practicing community managed natural farming. Those are the three.
Thank you. Melissa, Jyoti, do you have any additional examples you want to share?
Go
yeah,
for
go
it. No, go for it, Jyoti.
Well, I mean, I was going to give the example of Brazil with the public procurement systems because it is really brilliant. But also, you know, here in the UK, there's some things starting. It's definitely not perfect. It needs a lot more support. But you know, there's the ELMS, you know, which is the environmental land management schemes that's trying to try and get farmers to incorporate environmental land management practices if they get subsidy from the government on their production systems. And that needs more public support if it's going to be done right. Right now, it's just really underfunded and it's not being implemented as well as it could be, but it could really work if it got more public you know, voicing to government that it's really important to prioritize that and to prioritize the advice to farmers to make this transition happen. And yeah, there's more that could happen the more we're aware of these kind of different public policies, but public procurement's another big one that we could really start to move on here.
And have you got any examples from the UK where you see there are some sort of good examples led by local authorities, for example, rather than just the sort of soil association who's doing very good work, but it's NGO led?
Yeah, there was a great kind of hub around my area in Dorset that ran for a while. It stopped running now because of lack of public support after a little while, but it was collecting from local producers produce and then making that into school meals and redistributing them out to the school meals. And that was a really great way to incorporate lots of produce from lots of different small farms, process that in a way that was actually really healthy for children with less meat in the diet, and also achieve carcass balance as well, which is really important to farmers, to use the parts that actually would get exported overseas because they don't sell that well within the UK diet, and use less of it within a diet, and then you know and then provide this healthy school meals for kids, particularly kids who couldn't afford it otherwise.
Melissa.
The only thing, and I was so glad I'm last because I'm not an expert in this topic by any means, but the Brazil definitely comes to mind over the last decade or more as being more innovative and holistic in their approach. And I'm just thinking I think they had put forward a constitutional right to adequate food and then had a zero hunger campaign many years ago, and are on the forefront of now tracking that's this transition from malnutrition to obesity as well. And that the NOVA classification that Sarah put it in the chat and that I referenced in our last table discussion is coming out of Brazilian nutrition scientists and is being taken up by FAO and others. So they're just thinking about things more systemically and connecting the dots between ministries, but it's hard. I don't know that I have a good example off the top of my head of doing this at a systems level. It's not easy. Thanks.
So I think there's one question which also links to a broader question from Mara Kazaku. What do you think about the issue of herbicides associated with regen ag, where large farmers are still using and even depend on them to compensate the no or min-till policy practices as a kind of land clearing approach? Yeah.
Just a quick, I think if we the metric framework and sort of logic framework that we had laid out. And again, whether you only care about carbon or you're broader in your remit of thinking of what regen ag is supposed to touch, reduction of synthetic inputs, whether it's nitrogen fertilizer or chemical applications, right? A lot of agriculture, the GHG footprint that we see, it's driven by these synthetic inputs. And then the pesticide use in addition has toxicity effects in waterways and in soil, and it can be incredibly persistent and damaging to wildlife as well. In addition to the GHG footprint, there's emissions that have other effects. So absolutely, the idea of regenerative ag, you would hope to see a decrease on a farm, in a landscape, in a country overall of the per capita use, or of the production per input per production productivity over time. So it doesn't, again, imply reducing production and going back to a kind of agriculture that is not productive, but you would hope, and it doesn't mean no inputs at all. At least for us, it doesn't mean, organic all the way, but it should imply a sizable reduction in these kinds of things, and especially of things like synthetics and pesticides, especially. Thanks.
Good. Jyoti, Sarah, I mean, I can imagine your views on herbicides.
Yeah, I mean, glyphosate's incredibly dangerous, both for worker, farm worker and farmer health. And it destroys important microorganisms in the soil. So really, I think we wouldn't consider that part of regenerative agriculture. And there's a lot of debate when I go to shows like Groundswell between the farmers there. So I'm saying, actually, really, we need to really think about what the impact of this glyphosate is in comparison to the fact that you don't dig, and trying to come up with methods where it's not necessary anymore.
And they're expensive, and they undercut the return on investment and the farmer's bottom line. So many producers will tell you they reduce not just their market price and yield, but they reduce their input costs, and that's actually created a much better balance sheet for them, and in addition to all the health benefits and environmental benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So unless Sarah, you have some final comments on herbicides. I think one of the questions that, again, it's a question that's come up in the chat, but it's a question that I had flagged up earlier that we haven't really talked about, is the question of greenwashing. It's been alluded to, but I guess if we are all aware that it's a concern, and I think that's also true of companies who are trying to do the good thing because it's not in their interest to be tarred with the same brush, then how can it be called out and sort of dealt with? What are the strategies, and who should be doing it?
I mean, we've got some great organizations doing it already. I think FAIR and their report that came out last year that pulled the corporate filings of the 79 largest food and beverage companies claiming to do regen and said, this is what we see. Less than 30% define it. Less than 9% give $1 to farmers. That's the kind of critical analysis we need to see. As well, Planet Tracker does scrutiny on companies' commitments against this agenda, against where their dollars are actually flowing. But I think those kinds of efforts to really be bold in looking for the details behind the claims are critical. And then I think we also need to give, it kind of needs to go both ways. If we want corporates to go from where they are to deeper end, we also have to encourage them to take those steps and not make it look paralyzing not to get in the pool. And so I think about efforts like the big regenerative action agenda that was launched at COP, largely by corporates. They're saying, you got to give us a little time. We need to align on a framework, and then we are going to show up at COP30 with measurement. My own personal view on that is like, okay, let's give you the 2 years. You've got 2 years to come, but there better be something that we can measure and point to against this commitment that was made so publicly, and for which there's honestly like a desperate need to see the leadership in the corporate sector. So yes, let's remember the commitments that are made.
That's really, really useful, and you're absolutely right. There are organizations, I think they need their work needs to be amplified more. So Jyoti and Melissa, do you have anything further?
Well, just to say, like, being on the front line of trying to spread these other messages, it's incredibly difficult, because you go to any space, you know, like COP28 or the farmers constituency there, and you've got so many initiatives popping up there, like Regen 10 and Aim for Climate and things like that are trying to promote regenerative agriculture, the type that we would say was greenwash, as a solution, alongside a lot of other stuff that's really great solutions. But they outcompete all the time in their ability to meet with officials there, to try and, you know, get access, you know, financially just to any of the, you know, locations when any of these negotiations or decisions are being made, to try and, you know, have research that backs up what they're doing in certain ways. With any of the people trying to spread the counter message, often they're volunteers, they're people from the very grassroots, often with no English skills, you know, and very little budget to actually get involved in any of the negotiations in any key strategic ways. It's an extremely unlevel playing field just to get your voice heard, much less gain any power to put forward an alternative message. And I think supporting the social movements and the people trying to present an alternative message and giving support to dismantling this messages by consumers actually going and talking to country negotiators, helping people get access, is incredibly important, because otherwise we're always going to lose the game in trying to spread the truth.
Thank you. Melissa, any final thoughts there?
I think I really lift up what Jyoti said. I think it is complicated, right? We are, as a global conservation NGO, I'm going to say things that feel like it's going both ways, right? We work with companies. We feel like the inside game is part of the play insofar as it, only until it isn't. And that perhaps, like what Sarah's sentiment was, is that we need to meet people where they're at and get them to come aboard, because we need them, right? We can't scare them away. On the other hand, I agree with Jyoti, and I feel like the way to make sure there is accountability, the way to make sure that voices don't get drowned out, is to bring them to the same table in order to have these debates and hash them out and not be speaking in different rooms. And I feel like that is really what our role is, where we can. And I really appreciate the role of collective group of philanthropies like the Global Alliance of Future of Food, of which Rockefeller is a member of bringing more than 40 representatives from farmers groups and organizations to be at COP as best as they can, representing in these rooms. And even then it's hard. I still get it, Jyoti, but at least that voice was in some of these meetings, right? And then continuing to invest and build capacity, because we need it all on the one hand, but we also need to make sure those hard questions are asked of each other. And I think the frontline producers' voices are the most important of all. And so that's like in the bottom line is, where do the resources flow? Have they made it to the producers who have to do the change to start before it ever reaches someone like me or most of us on this call, not you, Jyoti. And so that, I think the fundamental accountability is, in a year from now, 5 years from now, 2 years from now at COP30, will we see changes in the numbers of financial flows? And will the producers who show up say, wow, I've started to see changes in how my community is receiving resources and able to make the shifts that need to happen on the ground, and companies are buying my products, right? Like that's the kind of stories we want to hear more of.
Thank you. And we are actually out of time. So I'm going to put a stop to any more questions. I think there'll be quite clearly from the discussion within the panelists, there'll be opportunities for and a need for further discussion even with it among us. But for now, thank you. That was a really, really great session, and lots to think about, and a million reports to read. And so it just remains for me to thank you once again, and also thank the audience for participating. And we will be posting a recording, and in due course our blog summarizing the discussion. And I hope this is the second of many future conversations that we have. So great. Goodbye. Thank you, everybody.